I think one of the things that many people miss throughout the globe is that one, a lot of these operations or a lot of the things that China does is not as sexy as what the United States does. So, and I'm not discounting, you know, I'm not discounting the operation at all, but headlines of an operation in Venezuela utilizing Delta Force to capture a foreign leader gains a lot more headlines, views, clicks, reshares, reposts, what have you, than China building a dam in Zimbabwe, if you will, or in the Gambia, or in the DRC. And realistically, that's almost by design because China wants to operate under the radar. They would rather for these projects not make the light of day until it's really too late for anyone to stop them. I think right now the argument can be made that China is winning. Excuse me, that China is winning just because of the fact that they don't really have to do anything. Unfortunately, as I say that, because you mentioned how the United States is doing all these as isolating itself through tariffs, building up and threatening our erstwhile NATO allies, and essentially denigrating other people, denigrating other leaders just because they can. I think, and China, much to its credit, I should say, because China caught on that, especially during the second term, that they don't really have to do anything. That all they have to do is look at Trump, the Trump administration, and say, we're going to do the exact opposite or nothing at all. And we'll just let them, we'll let the United States do what they do. But I will point out that Venezuela, the operation, and China's response kind of also highlighted the fact that China won't really come and help you.
Do you think that this may have emboldened China's decision around Taiwan?
That's a good question.
G'day, legends. I hope that you're having a fantastic day. And well, it's been a massive week. We've seen great powers shifting power all around the world. Of course, what we're going to be speaking about today is the US, the intervention, the very fast, the efficient intervention into Venezuela. I've got an expert here with me, Joaquin, who's been on the channel before, runs the very popular channel Sino Talk, speaking primarily about China. And what we're going to focus on today is, of course, what impact that this has had on China, that cutoff of the oil. Mr. Joaquin, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
You're welcome, man. Great to be back.
Mate, thank you very much. And thank you for keeping us all updated with the very intricate world, the very nuanced world of not only China, domestic, the military, but also internationally and how things are working. I know from an outside looking in, it gets incredibly complex to try and break any of this down. How do you most efficiently, most effectively go about actually analyzing then everything from the Chinese government through to the military?
That would depend upon like what I'm actually looking at. If I'm going to go with the Chinese government, then I would analyze it from 2 points of view. The first one will be what the Chinese government is doing, or at least in terms of policy they're going to try to implement. And then secondly, and more importantly, try to figure out what the CCP is doing, since that's the paramount power, and specifically what Xi Jinping wants.
Yeah. What about on the military front?
So for the military, you have to look at it, and I look at it from the context of they're a modernizing power or modernizing entity, and then from there, see what exactly they're doing to achieve that goal and to achieve their modernization goals, and then also slap a CCP layer on it, since the PLA is their own wing of the CCP.
Yeah. Mate, what has been your thoughts amongst the US, of course, then with this seizure of Maduro and what it looks like the US is going to do with this oil around Venezuela? What sort of impact are we likely to see on the Chinese? Because you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think a lot of people are somewhat reversing the numbers. I had a analyst reverse the numbers and said, well, China's now stuffed because 70% of their oil is now cut off. And I said, well, I believe your numbers, you've actually flipped the numbers. 70% of Venezuelan oil went to China. But as far as China's oil energy needs, Venezuela only represented around 4%, which is a lot smaller chunk than a lot of people are presuming. Is that correct? Or do you want to break down this whole situation around the oil in China?
No, it's you pretty much are correct. I mean, like, yes, people often cite that China is their number one importer of their oil, but when you break it down, Venezuelan oil only consisted of probably about 4 to 5% of it. And even then, it wasn't, used to fuel their economy. It was more to get the necessary fuel for asphalt and other similar products. Um, so the reason why people, think that, oh, well, China lost out on on their version of Saudi Arabia is because, people cite like 300 billion barrels in the Azako belt, I believe that's what it's called. Um, which is funny because it hasn't been exploited. Venezuela can't exploit it because, one, sanctions, and then two, the massive amount of corruption and mismanagement that existed within the government, or within the government itself, caused a lot of the infrastructure and a lot of the sites to just rot away, to decay over time.
Yeah, so this idea that the Chinese Saudi has been cut off, that it is significantly less impactful on that energy front. What about the infrastructure that China did put in to try and pull out some of this oil, and as well as their tankers?
I mean, it amounted to only like two. I think I'd mentioned this before in the first time I came on, but it was like only two floating platforms and we did some, or modernized at least two terminals. That's not going to really do much when the regime is only pumping out, or whenever Venezuela is only pumping out 1 million barrels per day. That's not really conducive to actually getting all of it out on its peak production of around 4 million barrels per day. I mean, is barely able to keep up with the 1 billion barrel per day that it currently does, and that's only because China hesitantly provided that infrastructure investment.
Mm. What do you see about these ships? Because we do know that there's been some ships that are potentially loaded with oil, likely, that are going on their way to China that the US is intercepting. How would the Chinese government see this?
So a lot of the ships that the United States have been seizing has been a part of Russia's shadow fleet. I believe one may have been part of China's. I don't really remember, but for the most part, China moves these ships, or uses those ships to move its oil. And even then, how they do it is kind of ingenious because, they get one tanker, they move it to most of the way, through the Cape of Good Hope and into Southeast Asia. past the Strait of Malacca / Singapore, and around the lower part of the South China Sea. That's where they do the offloading or the transfer. You can actually see this on satellite if you have the money and time to actually look for it. Look for them. And so a lot of people cite that as being, an alternative economy, but realistically for China, it's them seeking repayment of loans that, Venezuela doesn't really have the ability to do. They just don't have the ability to repay the loan, with the exceptions, or loans, as I say, without that help from China. And even then, it's not as if China's going all out. It's them looking realistic at the situation and say, okay, well, they only have oil and it's low quality oil. We can just get enough to where we can just pull out what we need to be able to repay the loans. I don't even think the oil itself was enough to repay the interest or the principal on the loans. But another aspect is that how, Russia uses the same thing, uses Venezuela to, get the oil and then also transport it to Russia for its own uses.
Yeah, be a part of Russia's wider shadow fleet, which we have seen the US intercept one in the past 48 hours. Actually, potentially two. One may have actually been more linked to China. So we are seeing the US take a little bit more of an aggressive stance towards this. But as far as cutting off this oil, and we talk that it's not 70% like some are making out. It's more like 4, maybe 5%. But where is China going to backfill this somewhere? Because of course, if that's cut off your needs, you're still going to have to bring that in from somewhere else. How easy will it be for them to do that, and where may they do it from?
Relatively easy, actually. Iran, UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, where they usually get oil from. And then also Russia as well, since they, ironically enough, have the same quality oil that they mainly produce, which a lot of Russian Telegram chat room was ablaze in the days after the abduction or Operation Absolute Spear, when they were saying that, well, this should have never happened because, now we have nothing left, alluding to the only thing that's really propping up the Russian economy currently, which is oil. And even then, they had to sell it at a steep discount to India and China and other countries.
Yeah. So now China will lean further on them for that. I see that this could be.
Yeah.
Could this be somewhat though as a benefit for China? For Russia, if China is seeking another 4% to fill that 4% of oil at however many barrels per day that may be, and then they're having to buy it from Russia, wouldn't that line the Russian coffers more?
A little bit in the short term, but then you have to think about it from the long term. That eventually, if Trump can get oil companies to invest in Venezuela and the Venezuelan government, comes to an agreement with those companies that say, okay, you can have your the sites that we nationalized back in the early 2010s, I believe. Then they can say, once all that is secured, then they'll be able to pump out the oil, which is 3 million barrels per day at its peak, or maybe even up to 4 million barrels. And so compare that with Russia, who can barely pump out less. I don't know the numbers, but I'm pretty sure that it's significantly less than before the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. And even then, you're looking at for approximately 3 to 4 million barrels compared to what Russia produces, and most of that would be sanctioned, and they have to sell it at a steep discount. Whereas the Venezuelan oil, all the sanctions are going to eventually go away, and they're going to And Trump said that they're going to let anyone buy it, including China. So long term, it's going to hurt them more than anything.
But wouldn't China look at buying the sanctioned Russian oil because, as you said, they'd have to be at a steep discount? Russia's desperate to sell it because it is one of their main drivers of their economy. China, India, they don't care where the oil is coming from. They care which they're getting the best deal on. And if, therefore, the Venezuelan oil is being sold by the US in USD at the price of oil without the sanctioning discount on that, wouldn't that make it more attractive? Like we've seen India, it's almost impossible to get them to stop buying Russian oil because they're, well, where else are we going to get it from for this cheap? And we'll just refine it ourselves.
Well, that's an interesting question because one, it's based upon the premise that Russia would be willing to embolden itself more to China, in which there's always been this two schools of thought within the Russian government and its elites. Is that one hand you have people who are associated with Putin who want to align more with China because one, they're brothers in the multipolar world, if you will, and then two, that's realistically their only option that they have to do. Yeah, they can try to rely on BRICS, but they're literally BRICS. I mean, like Brazil, uh, India, South Africa, Ethiopia. I think Saudi Arabia is part of them now. So you have all these groups who can't really assist China or assist Russia economically like China can. So realistically, he has to do that. Whereas on the other flip side of that, you have people who view this as an affront to China or an affront to the Russian dream, if you will. The dream that Russia has to become resurgent power, not like the Soviet Union, but more like the Russian czars of old, where they did own a large chunk of Eastern Europe, to include Ukraine, to include Finland, to include Armenia and the rest of the Caucasus, and also Central Asia. And so they kind of see that as being a slap in the face to what Putin's doing or want to do in terms of trying to increase Russia's relations with China.
Yeah. Well, there's this idea too of China and Russia being more reliant on China, that you could slip into being basically a vassalage of that hyperpower of China. That if at the end of the day they control, your economy through the purchase of your oil, through a lot of your trade, and potentially even further military-industrial relationship as well, which of course China has a much larger manufacturing base than Russia, that therefore your three pillars of sovereignty really get swung for Russia, for Putin, into China. And if China says jump, then he has to basically say how high. But if China starts, flexing, well, we just won't buy your oil and you don't have any other option, you see how quickly then they can really influence Russian international and domestic politics. This is, of course, why many have said it's so important to try and get China on the side of Ukraine, because they could have a huge impact on how this war ends.
Yes, I mean, that's always been the fear, and I kind of alluded to it indirectly, is that Russia don't really want to see itself as a junior partner, but for all intents and purposes, it is. Even, for example, even in the Southern Asia, Central Asia region, Russia, and it is Russia. It can be said that Russia lost a lot of its influence with the Stan countries, where it used to be part of the Soviet Union. So, and that was because one, all the countries there, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan, they all collectively looked and said no. Where they saw Russia espousing that the Soviet Union needs to be rebuilt, or the Soviet Union or the grandeur of Russia needs to be renewed in some way, they all collectively looked and said, "Oh shit," because they were they know what would happen. They know what happens whenever Russia starts saying those things. They somehow get brought into the imperial yoke, and so they saw that, and they looked at the East, or yeah, they looked at the East, and they saw China bringing in the BRE investments, bringing in companies, the companies to produce stuff there to bring modernization, if you will, to these countries, and they realized that we would we would eventually be beholden to China as well, in which some countries such as um, Uzbekistan and to a certain extent Kyrgyzstan view it as okay, because on the flip side, look at what they had to deal with Russia. While others like Kazakhstan, and I believe to a lesser extent, um, Uzbekistan as well, they see trying to get anyone involved in their economy, including the United States, including France, including South Korea, including Turkey, as a way to prevent them from being pulled from either side, but more so Russia than anyone.
Mm. To loop back to China, Venezuela, the link that is happening there. Not only, so we've spoken about the oil, and it doesn't seem to be that big of a deal for China, but how do you see the geopolitical situation at which China has lost somewhat of a foothold within South America?
So that one, they lost their primary one of three footholds they have in Latin America. And to set the case, or to set the stage in terms of geography, when I say Latin America, I'm talking about from Mexico down to Argentina and everything in between, including the Caribbean and the three other countries that don't speak Spanish or Portuguese. So within that context, they lost one of three footholds within Latin America. The other one is Ecuador, and the other one is Honduras, which they likely will lose soon too, since they've elected a president who wants to reverse the decision of the previous government to go back to recognizing Taiwan. So in that context, that's why you kind of see they're probably panicking right now, because in one fell swoop they're losing two of their three footholds in Latin America. Now I know some viewers will probably say, well, Cuba is an important one too, but is an important outpost too for China. However, Cuba doesn't give them the same benefits as Honduras, Ecuador, and Venezuela does. It doesn't, because it's closed off. It doesn't allow. There's not much trade compared to the other countries. Yeah, China invested in it in terms of in some economics, as well as creating, I believe, up to 3 spy bases. But honestly, when you compare that to what China gained from being in Venezuela, Ecuador, and Honduras, it's apples and oranges.
So can you tell us about the benefits of being in Ecuador, Honduras as well?
Yeah, so for I'll hit on Honduras, since that was the one that was the most recent to be to be one of their centers. So that allowed China, one, to increase their investment within Central America, to show the region that, hey, there's benefits to being aligned with China more so than the United States in terms of economics as well as financial. And then on the flip side, um, it was a win in terms of trying to remove the remaining diplomatic allies from Taiwan, because before Honduras recognized China and supposedly allowed all this free trade to occur. I'll touch upon why I say alleged, supposed. Um, Honduras recognized Taiwan, so that allows them to say, well, Taiwan isn't really recognized. They don't have really any diplomatic relationships with anyone. Honduras is on the right side of history. If I'm going to use the age of one of China's talking points, there that was a thing that they always pointed out whenever this occurred. However, after it occurred, China realistically only used Honduras for its own devices, specifically to say that, hey, we've Taiwan is only part of Taiwan is part of us, a country search recognition to China, recognizing that, hey, Taiwan is an inalienable part of China. So pretty soon, no one will care about the island. And then on top of that, the supposed economic rewards, if you will, from doing such a thing. And that didn't really come about. In fact, a lot of Honduras's agricultural and seafood export markets suffered precisely because China didn't want to import their seafood or agricultural stuff. They just didn't want to. They had no interest in it, even though they said they would. Honduras, was kind of seen with a, I forgot what the adage was, but they were left with they were footed with the bill that they had to pay, which is in terms of we're sitting on all this shrimp and other exports that no one wants. That was really only for Taiwan, because Taiwan was able to absorb a large portion of that, but China doesn't. They have no care for it.
But why would China? Why would a country as large as China, with the influence of China, why would they care if Honduras recognized Taiwan or not? As far as on the informational front of whether there's recognition of Taipei or not, why would they care less if there's not more political or more either geostrategic benefit to Honduras or economic potential?
It's the fact that they're removing. It goes back to their long-running diplomatic game that they're doing in terms of trying to push Taiwan's remaining allies or diplomatic allies to switch over to them. That's always been the case. They were pretty successful in it. They were pretty successful, especially in, ironically enough, Central America as well, Central America. And so that enables them to say, hey, you have no allies. No one recognizes you as a sovereign entity. The only one that does is Vatican City. And we don't really care what the Pope says, because at the end of the day, the Pope only cares for getting assurances from China to operate within Chinese territory without any major issue. And so you have to look at it from that perspective, is that they really use it as a psychological game, and then also as a long running diplomatic uh, narratives showing that Taiwan has no allies. Because Taiwan, that was one of the things that was significant with Taiwan, is that, hey, we have 11 or 12 allies that recognizes us diplomatically, and China said, well, not if I have something to say about it. And so you kind of see that play out unsuccessfully, as to say, in Paraguay, where you actually had a Chinese diplomatic staff person. I believe he was a businessman. I forgot which one. He went into the Paraguayan parliament and said, you guys need to recognize China because of the economic benefits that it has, and to be on the right side of history, but economics. And so they view that so they said that, and so as whenever that came out, it caused a lot of issues between not only Paraguay and China, but also Paraguay and Taiwan, because of the fact that, hey, here is this Chinese person that's actively interfering with with Paraguayan internal affairs, something that China always says they don't do. But we literally have them on audio talking in Spanish, I believe, to the Paraguayan parliament. And not only that, but it shows you the level of influence him and the other group that enabled him to do that has within China, or has within Paraguay, I should say.
So, with China losing some of its influence and potentially losing more through Central and South America, what do you believe the response will be? Will they try and hang on to this, or will they happily or more peacefully let it go?
I think they'll try to hang on to Honduras, but they're going to have to really provide some tangible benefits in terms of economics, because right now Taiwan is telling them, like, hey, China lied to you. We told you this would happen. We're willing to help you guys out, but you have to recognize us again. And they're going to go through that diplomatic game will play out. And I think China will increase its leverage, or try to increase its influence in Ecuador as well as Colombia, potentially, just so that it can have another foothold in Latin America, to make up for Venezuela, for the loss of Venezuela and a potential loss of Honduras. And barring Colombia, they'll probably put all their chips in Ecuador, because they have the major because they have that mega port there that allows them to essentially cut out the United States in terms of trade with Latin America.
Could we see in this aim to not only potentially recover but also maintain, could we see China have kinetic action by its own military in some of these areas?
No, I mean, the Chinese military can barely go into the Western Pacific and Indian Ocean, and that's only with an aircraft carrier that is only being supported by one resupply ship, and in the Indian Ocean can only send like 2 frigates, or 1 destroyer and 1 frigate and 1 resupply ship. So their ability to conduct power projection or their ability to project power within Latin America would be extremely limited, if not impossible at this moment. even then, that's something they would like to do within the next 20 years, but they're not ready now.
Right. What about the size of their navy? Because as far as my understanding is, their navy has surpassed the size of America's. But you're saying they couldn't project the power there?
No, I mean that's one thing. Yeah, they have a lot of ships, but do they have the ability to sustain operations?
Hmm.
So if you look at the operation, the circumnavigation that they did in Australia
Yeah.
last year, around this time last year, it, you know, that was only 4 or 5 ships, I believe, of that task force. And even then, they just they sailed around Australia and went back home. To believe Joseon in eastern China. That wasn't them conducting, any type of really intensive any intensive naval operations. If they were try to do the same in Latin America, they would be extremely limited in terms of logistics as well as their ability to even project power because realistically, um there will be the ones playing far from home with none of those capabilities, whereas United States, we would be playing in our backyard. So essentially, their roles would be reversed when people talking about a potential Taiwan conflict or a conflict between the United States and China in the Western Pacific.
Hmm. Within Venezuela, we know that there was some level of Chinese weapon systems that have appeared to hold up a lot worse than they did in the India-Pakistan war. Can you talk to us about that and what's becoming of this? I know there were some older S-300 systems that were suppressed, but what about the Chinese systems that were allegedly or apparently within Venezuela and the difference we've seen from Pakistan's operation of these?
Yeah, so I kind of knew this question was going to be asked. um, maybe it's been a major question. It's one of those things where you have to understand is that one is that the YJ-27 that many people talk about or highlight, it's a relatively old system. Um, you're talking about, I believe they have the most. I believe Venezuela bought the most one of the early versions of it, so it didn't really have as much capabilities as this current version that China operates. And then also, you also take into consideration that the Venezuelan military probably hasn't maintained it, or never asked China to send specialists to maintain it as they should be or as they should have. And then on the flip side of that, you have to take into account that the radar's location as well as if they were active at the time, because you can't keep these radars. You can't keep radars active all the time. If you do, I feel sorry for the crew members that are there surrounded by it. And then two, you're going to eventually fry out the electronics eventually, potentially, just because they generate a lot of heat and they generate a lot of radiation, and those two things are going to adversely affect the components. So they have to, turn it off from time to time to let it rest and to let it cool down, so they can actually conduct sure some ad hoc maintenance to it. So you have to take that into account. China, ironically enough, didn't have Chinese SA systems uh, or air defense systems. It was all Russian / Soviet era systems, as is the S-300 and the Bulk 3M that were pretty much destroyed. Um, But it just shows you that one, the Venezuelans weren't as prepared as they thought they were, despite them producing as many and producing the nice propaganda video showing them setting up the systems. But then also the fact that, they themselves probably suffered from the same maintenance issues as the Chinese radars. And so you can't really write them off as being useless because of the fact that you had a country who probably didn't maintain them and probably didn't use them effectively compared to Pakistan. So with Pakistan, they were able to use the Chinese equipment effectively, specifically the J10 and specifically the J10 and the PL-15E, because they were able to develop a kill chain and a means to communicate with all of the components of its air defense system, to include, the radars that are on the ground, to its AWACS aircraft, which, contrary to popular belief, they weren't Chinese. They were actually the Arii, I believe, or another aircraft that wasn't Chinese made, because they took them back. They sent them back to China because they just didn't work. And then you were able to get all that to talk with each other. So that's where the success. So that's why the Pakistanis were so successful in employing Chinese equipment, is because, one, they were able to develop a system that enabled them to utilize its strengths effectively, but then also they were more competent than the Venezuelans because of necessity.
Yes, I've seen a lot of people have this idea that this is evidence that these Chinese air defense systems and other weapon systems are nothing more than a paper tiger and not a threat at all for military operations. But I think they've got to add the idea that this is a highly corrupt, very poor nation as well. And these are older systems of which they've got. The maintenance on these systems can be extreme, and you need skilled professionals not only to maintain but also operate the systems also. Do you agree that this is not a good case study of China's air defense capacity?
It's not, because, for one, they have their own air defense systems that Russia didn't buy. Yeah, they have some overlap. The HQ-9 can be said is derived from the S-300, but I believe the version of the S-300 that Venezuela operates is not really the same as the one that China bought and subsequently reverse engineered to help develop the HQ-9. And then the Bulk 3M, China has its own. However, they've took that and actually improved upon it. So much so that you can argue that, much like its flankers, the J11, J15, and J16, it's their own indigenous version. And so I think you shouldn't look at it as a case study on how Chinese air defense systems could potentially fail. I think it would probably be a case study in how corruption and maintenance shortfalls can adversely affect your air defense capabilities and ability to defend against adversaries or potential enemies with advanced SME/DEED capabilities and ability to project power surgically at the tactical level. I think that's going to be the case study that all nations are going to probably look at this as, including China.
With this more blatant, obvious return to raw power politics by the US, of we want this, regardless of how other countries may look at this, regardless of international law, that we're going in, we're knocking off the leader, we're capturing him, capturing his wife, we're taking your oil, we're taking your country, and then your country is now made to buy our products, as Trump released yesterday. There's just power politics at play. Do you think that this may have emboldened China's decision around Taiwan?
That's a good question. No, because there's a lot of people who say that it hasn't, and then there's a lot of people who say it has. I'm of the opinion that it hasn't emboldened China's rationale on Taiwan, on their wanting to take over Taiwan or moving up any timeline they may have, real or imagined. I think it gives them another layer of argument to show that, hey, we're able to capture all these people from Taiwan, these Taiwanese secessionist leaders, because we charged them in our courts. And since Taiwan is a part of China, you can't really say anything. Even if you try to say that it's its own country, look at the United States, what the United States did. You know, it's one of those things, it's one of those play on phrases and words and actions that China is really well known for. And they've kept on saying, and I actually got like a lot of the press releases that they released about the operation. And so one of the things that stood out to me is, which is I always find funny whenever China says this, is that the United States actions clearly violate international law and basic norms governing international relations, as well as the purposes and principles of the UN Charter. And they went on similarly to always hammer the United States, that aspect regarding not only this operation, but anything else that the United States does, or Japan, or any other countries that they feel as if they've been slighted by. Which I find funny, because the same could be said, the same has been said, I should say, about China whenever it's found out that they do interfere with another country's internal affairs or international law. So it's one of those things where they love to use narrative notes and poke fun at, or not poke fun, but to point out the United States operations or what it did, and cast it as the evildoer. Whereas the Chinese would say, we don't do this. We're a third world country. We will protect. We are the global South's champion, if you will. We look at how the United States is treating our fellow third global South member. And so it's that play on words that China really uses to showcase that, hey, you know, we won't do this, even though there's been documented cases that they actually do. So it's like,
But do you believe they have a lot of success with that messaging? Because as I brought up more so yesterday, is China have a lot of international influence in a lot of countries, but it's very hidden. It's very cunning. It can be insidious. It can be building a railway. It can be influencing the government. It can be paying off. It could even be with drugs. Where what we see the US doing is the US is more public, more blatant. And people will say, well, I haven't seen China move into Iraq, conduct a bombing campaign based on a lie, have 1 million Iraqis dead, years of war, then Afghanistan, this, then that. Now, I'm not disagreeing that China have a lot of international influence, of which they say that they may not be trying to do and trying to gain power. But the way I see them trying to gain power is not through kinetic operations like this, is more grey zone warfare, long-term influence ops, which of course not as many people are privy to. And therefore a lot of people, and I think including a lot of Australians, I think including a lot of Americans, see America as far more aggressive on the global stage due to the way that it's carried out.
I agree to an extent that China likes to hide its influence operations, especially the more nefarious ones. You had the ones that happened in Australia, and of course, the United States. However, China also plays the economic influence game as well within the global South, and also the diplomacy game as well. And so that's where they shine in terms of winning cred with a lot of these countries, because especially in Africa, they have a long-standing relationship with these countries because they were always there. The Chinese went in and helped them develop at a time when they were essentially newly formed countries that really didn't receive help from countries such as France or the UK or the United States. And even when they did, it was seen as more of a one check in the box saying that, hey, we're here to help you. We're here to, they go out in the fields or they go out in the wilderness and they go do whatever project they're doing. But at the end of the day, the Westerners will go back to the hotel to go sleep in nice air-conditioned rooms, whereas the Chinese, they literally slept with the Africans. Like, they slept with them. And so you have that buy-in saying that, hey, we're a part of you. We've lived through this too. We understand what it means to come from nothing, if you will.
Mm.
And so not only that, but they also see China as being a modernized quote unquote country, coming from a place where in some instances were just like they were whenever they just started, wherever they started out, or whenever they're like trying to get on their feet in terms of modernization. And then also you have the economic, where China's willing to build the railroads, they're willing to build the highways, they're willing to provide other forms of investment to these countries so they can build infrastructure. It may not last, but it's there, and it shows that, hey, I'm able to take the train from my village or take the train from the provincial capital to the national capital because China built it. And so there's that degree of influence there. And China likes to flaunt that or try to utilize that in other ways, such as diplomacy. Going back to Taiwan, they have a lot of African countries actually sign on to saying that, hey, the UN charter, the UN resolution that was signed that recognized China actually means that Taiwan is part of China as well. And so they leverage that in that way. But we also have to remember that China also utilizes influence, the more sketchy influence operations that it does in Europe, the United States, and Australia, and Africa, and other places as well. But it's overshadowed by the more overt influence.
Yeah, but my point was more not saying that it's not there. but how many people see this as far more legitimate or peaceful, or that it doesn't make the news because, well, yeah, we know they're trying to influence the government, but they're building a railroad and a port and this, and they're trying to influence and buy, buy votes, buy favor. But on the other side, you've got the way, say, America and Venezuela is they want influence there, so we'll take the leader and have a follow-on attacks if we need. I'm not saying that therefore one is right or wrong. My point is more that you can see around the world how, and the way I think we see them conduct themselves, which is I think if you did a poll in Australia around who do you see has more imperialist ambition between China and America, those who are not privy to politics and not sitting down and reading this and that would say, well, it's America all over and over again. And who has more international aggression? They would also say the US, because it's so much more public facing. It's so much done in such a US fashion of, hurrah, we're taking your leader, stealing your oil. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but in the game of power politics, how then other countries may see you as more friendly than the reverse side, because it does seem that China will comfortably work with a country that doesn't have their same ideology, where the US, to a degree, won't. That the US will only see a state as legitimate if it's democratic and to a degree liberal, and otherwise you're on the chopping block for war.
I will agree with you on that because, and again, it goes back to how they leverage a lot of their influence because, a lot of these countries, they've already viewed China, they already viewed the United States as, the great imperialist or as an imperialist power, or they just see indifference to it. And then you see China actually going in and doing all these things, as you pointed out, and they say like, well, China's not doing it, but the United States is being this bad imperialist power. Why should we support the United States instead of China? And I think, and this kind of goes back to the influence operations and influence ops that they do. China likes to play that notion that they're not an imperialist power, even though there's evidence to the contrary. And so I think one of the things that many people miss throughout the globe is that, one, a lot of these operations, or a lot of the things that China does is not as sexy as what the United States does. So, and I'm not discounting, I'm not discounting the operation at all, but headlines of an operation in Venezuela utilizing Delta Force to capture a foreign leader gains a lot more headlines, views, clicks, reshares, reposts, what have you, than China building a dam in Zimbabwe, if you will, or in the Gambia, or in the DRC. And realistically, that's almost by design because China wants to operate under the radar. They would rather for these projects not make the light of day until it's really too late for anyone to stop them. Because with these projects, they don't have a lot of human rights, or they don't have a lot of strings attached like the United States or other countries do regarding these projects or the loans to actually finance them. But they do have strings in terms of economic influence, diplomatic, financial, government, that a lot of people, when they see those headlines, they get the same amount of attention as the sexy headlines. But, after, 3 to 4 days, it goes away. So you have to look at it from that perspective, is that, there's always going to be China's always going to play that game of being able to fly under the radar, thanks to what the United States does, for lack of a better term, or really any other bigger, more juicy news bites that are out there, or current events.
And do you think this is part of the different systems between a liberal democracy and a I guess it's hard to describe exactly China's sort of hybrid communist but authoritarian leadership with the Politburo under it, that because you don't have a nationwide vote and a different party come in every 4 years, that this awards China the ability to be able to think decades or even a century ahead, unlike the US, where we can't launch an operation to build a dam and a bridge and buy influence over decades in a state, that we need to go in while ex-president has executive power, overthrow and gain. Do you think that that is something that is different in the long-term leadership of the nations too?
I don't think it's part of the leadership. I think it's more of the game plan of how of the overarching power.
But what
Or
my
how they're
point is more, can China play this game plan, this longer term, more insidious game plan, due to their government structure, more so than the US can?
I would say yes, but that's only because you have to understand that a lot of the vehicles they utilize and how they conduct these operations are a part of the CCP or adjacent to the CCP. And so that's why they're able to conduct. That's why I kind of phrase my response in the way it did, is because it's not so much as the governing leadership of the body. It's more of the government apparatuses themselves. I should have said that, because these entities that do this, the CTAFE, the United Front Work Department, they're always going to be there in some capacity, if not in their original capacity. The United States doesn't have anything similar to that. They just don't. You can make the argument that the State Department is, in terms of the investment they provide, but from my perspective, that's a really big reach. And so from that perspective, China can do these operations in a long term, just because they actually have the apparatuses or the vehicles to do it. Whether it be United Front Work Department, CTAFE, the BRI now, the various the ability to issue loans from the state-owned banks, and or to even donate equipment and resources to these people, to these countries as well.
So
Whereas
you
United
had an
States,
acronym. Sorry, not to cut you off, but you had an acronym there. I understand BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. What is the CTFE or CTFE? You said.
wait one
You
second.
said-
Wait
No,
one
you're right.
second. Let me pull it up, because I say it, but I always forget that it's a really weird acronym, just because not many people know about it, which goes to show you how good China is in terms of playing, the influence games.
Hmm. This is a good ad break for me to put in.
No, you're fine. I'm just trying to figure out like where that where's the stuff.
Yeah,
So
no
yeah,
worries at all.
you go ahead and put the ad break in. I
Oh no,
apologize.
you're right, mate. Trust me. There's I know in my service in the mill, I would refer to a heap of acronyms all the time. of which I know the spirit of the acronym, but then if it was asked to break down letter by letter, I'd run into a bit of trouble with, with a lot of it.
Yeah, especially with the Chinese one because they like to have them, and like if you don't really or if you don't really know what they are on a daily basis or work with them on a daily basis, then you'll be kind of stuck. But no, like TTAFI is the Chinese People Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so that one, what a lot of people don't really know, well, most people don't know about this, is that its parent organization is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but realistically, it's really an entity under the United Front Work Department. So that's why I mean, like, so that's why I mean, like, United States doesn't have any of the vehicles that China does because it's really, if you're going to look at that, like the CTAFI as a case study, it's very unique because one, ostensibly, it's located under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. However, it's has a really, really big United Front work emphasis, almost to the point to where it could be described as being an extension of it in terms of trying to work with overseas counterparts, um, overseas association in different parts of the world. And realistically, is one of the few organizations that I know of whose president is also the party secretary for the entire organization, which that's a big red flag, or which is a big indicator, I should say, not a red flag, that the entity itself isn't a government organization, but a party organization. So,
and these organizations, these are the ones who arrange under the Workers' Party as far as going into these states, the planning, the carrying out, the operation of, if it is building a dam or a bridge or a railway or an airport.
They could be, but I would emphasize that this is more CTAFI, or the Chinese People Association for Friendship and with Foreign Countries. They do a lot of influence ops. They do a lot of these are the ones, whenever you hear of, a overseas association is helping run an overseas police station or or anything, or doing dissident harassment, or helping the Chinese government in some way, even though they're not, registered as a foreign agent, or even have any legitimate connections to China. They would be connected in some way back to CTAFI, whether it be actually heading under them, or meeting with the president or other members of the organization.
So I realize we're on a time schedule here. So this will be the last. Oh, yeah, okay. I guess to wrap this all up for what this video is about, in Venezuela, US, Russia, really, and this great game, the great power chessboard. Who do you think is winning this at the moment between America and China? I use often an example of when we had just Ferraris and Lamborghinis, we had supercars. And then when Koenigsegg and Pagani, Bugatti came on the block, we had to create this new category of hypercars. And I've said that we've had these great powers for some time, America, China, Russia, India, and institutions like the EU. But now that the US and China seem to have risen to such a new level of themselves. So it created this category almost as like these hyperpowers that it would be unfair to compare Russia to China or America. Now that we've got these two massive entities in this moving to a bipolar system, who do you think is winning this great power struggle that we're between? Of course, you've got the US carrying out operations like in Venezuela. You've got the US really isolating itself from some of the allies in Europe, even Australia to a degree. You've got the tariffs, you've got the building up of the American military, and then you've got China, of course, building their military, looking eastwards towards Taiwan, looking in directions into South Central America, into Africa, into Asia. Who do you think is winning maybe in the short term, like currently, and who's on the trajectory to gain more power between the US and China?
So I think right now the argument can be made that China is winning. Excuse me. That China is winning just because of the fact that they don't really have to do anything. Unfortunately, as I say that, because you mentioned how the United States is doing all these as isolating itself through tariffs, building up and threatening our erstwhile NATO allies, and essentially denigrating other people, denigrating other leaders just because they can. I think, and China, much to its credit, I should say, because China caught on that, especially during the second term, that they don't really have to do anything. That all they have to do is look at Trump, the Trump administration, and say, we're going to do the exact opposite or nothing at all. And we'll just let them, and we'll let the United States do what they do. But I will point out that Venezuela, the operation and China's response also highlighted the fact that that China won't really come and help you. That all you will get is diplomatic statements saying that, hey, bad United States, and saying like, oh, well, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do that, China, or you shouldn't do that, United States. Sorry, Maduro. LOL. But right now, China's winning the influence game. Now, will that always be the case? I kind of doubt that. But right now, China is winning, and that's only because they don't really have to do much of anything. They could just essentially sit back, relax, and let the United States essentially shoot itself in the foot in terms of losing allies and isolating ourselves from the rest of the world.
I think a good example of this would be, and I haven't carried out this poll, so I don't know, but I think if you walked down the main street of a city in Australia, even a city in America, and asked a lot of people, do you have a more favourable opinion of Trump or Xi? I think many people, especially in Australia, would say Xi. I think a lot of people in America would say Xi also. Now, whether they are right or wrong in that correction, you can debate. But I think that alone tells you a lot about how people see the Trump administration, even if they may have a misunderstanding of the situation that is occurring in the great power politics game or of his policy itself. But I think that tells us a lot about how people see these great states operating on the power chessboard at the moment. But you say that China currently is winning the influence game, but you say you don't think that's going to occur long term. Can you explain that? Because to me, it looks to me, and I'm not the expert on the China that you are, it appears the opposite way. It appears to me that China may be winning the influence game currently, but I can see, I think in the decades to come, that they will, the fruits of that labor that they've put into these states will start to, or the seeds that they've planted in these states will start to bear fruit and that influence gain will actually speed up exponentially. Why do you say that the opposite to this?
Well, the reason why is because, for all the seeds that they plant, whether it be, investment, BRI, the influence ops they do, and the gain, influence within these countries, you also have to look at the flip side of it. China got a lot of heat in a lot of these countries, not only Africa, but Serbia as well. I believe Hungary too, and I believe some countries in the Middle East, because for all the investment that they do, for all the promises that they make, they always come up short because they always say, "Well, we're going to teach you people. We're going to teach you how to run these how to run these factories, how to run these manufacturing plants." That's a lie. We know it's a lie because every time these factories are built, or every time these factories are being constructed or being built or being operated, they always bring in people from China to do it, and they don't train the locals on how to do it. They only use them as essentially low skill labor, ironically enough, to produce the products or to build the factories or infrastructure. And they have no bother to teach them or even to mine the stuff too, which, you know, which has caused a lot of issues, which has caused a lot of incidents. You had, I believe in Gabon or the Gambia in Western Africa, where Chinese people has been attacked because of the fact that, you know, they mistreated Africans so badly that they rose up against them, which, if you ever studied African, the colonial period in Africa, that says a lot. When a country, when the local population says we're going to beat you now because you mistreated us. Um, and then on top of that, you have all that discontent, and then also you have, the perception that China, for all its ability to provide us with these, nice infrastructure, they also like to dump things on us. Essentially pushing out the local manufacturing hubs, the local manufacturers, the local industries get gutted to include the shops, small and medium mom and pop shops, if you will, and they get replaced by these Chinese run stores that have the support of larger enterprises because they're able to import cheaply into those countries. And so you have that. So you have those two layers of discontent within within most of the countries, and so you have to take that into account when you're talking about Chinese influence increasing or decreasing. Because yes, it can decrease, but more than likely in the long term, it will decrease or stagnate just because people see this too. People suffer from the infrastructure or what the Chinese bring, despite what the government alleges to be true.
But is America really that much successful with influence operations, from infrastructure to coups to everything outside of the West that China is?
I would say this is that the United States is not innocent in terms of how we previously mistreated people or how we've how we've dealt with countries. I will say that we learn from our mistakes and try to actually rectify them, to actually try, to become better, to become, to try to at least help these countries out. Even though most people say that, well, the, International Monetary Union, these loans, they don't really help people, they continuously push them down. Yes, but you also have to understand is that in the long term, they're trying to stabilize the economy, or they're trying to, develop it in the way that would help out. And so that's the reason why there's a lot of strings attached to those loans, whether it be, to Greece, Spain, Ireland, I believe Portugal, and them wanting to essentially restructure their entire government slash economy so that this doesn't happen again.
Mm.
So their massive defaults don't happen again.
Yeah.
And on the flip side, it's the same thing. We structure the loans. The IMF structures the loans, or the United States structures the loans in such a way to prevent or to help prevent a default, those countries from defaulting. Even then, we are willing to talk or renegotiate the deals or the loans if needed. China isn't. China literally had, like, in the case of Sri Lanka, China was literally the only one, was the last one who held out, is the best phrase to put it, when Sri Lanka was trying to refinance the loans, because they defaulted on essentially all of them. And China said no. They kept on saying no until they saw the writing on the wall, when every single other country who had loaned Sri Lanka money said, we will help you with this. We will help you get your economy right. And so China at that point saw, well, we also have to go to the table, because we will look like the bad guys, and we can't let that happen under any circumstance because of our rep. And despite them knowing that the very large potential of other countries who suffer the same thing, or are going through the same thing, or similar to Sri Lanka, saying, we would like to renegotiate our loans too, please. Because China never wanted to renegotiate the loans. I believe they still don't, because of the fact that once the renegotiations happen, the floodgates open, so to speak, and they would have to actually take hits on a lot of those loans. Hits that the BRI bank and their economy by extension can't really take, more so now than previously.
Yeah. Look, it's hard with the international, with the influence internationally between America and China, because the way I see at the moment is China is gaining influence at whatever rate that they are gaining influence in different areas of the world, including in some Western states as well. And the US is bleeding influence incredibly quickly. That it's not only bleeding influence in some areas that are not friendly to the US, but it's bleeding influence in countries of which are friendly to the US, seen as allies, with the criticism or the tariffs of a state like Australia, or especially the European states, that the way America is seen, the way America is trusted, and therefore can influence, has absolutely been shattered, even down to just the leadership of the White House, whether it even is just mocking of France or Germany, or the criticism of the systems within these nations. And I'm not saying that these states shouldn't have criticism against them, or even to the level of mockery. I do it myself to Europe. But I think that the US, as far as this isolating itself, which we've spoken about, that the US is becoming more isolationist away from its allies, and they have openly said in the National Security Assessment, as well as J.D. Vance at Munich, and of course you can point to 1,000 different tweets from Trump, that they are just on a different path than the other democratic liberal states. And that's where I see that America, I struggle to think, is going to regain influence at a faster rate. But no, I guess no one has a crystal ball.
No, I agree with you in the fact that, a lot of what's said about, United States, I would go as far as saying, I think I mentioned this previously, is that it is mocking. Like, let's be honest. it says a lot when a sitting U.S. president or when a sitting vice president who was previously in the Marine Corps who deployed to Iraq says, the Dutch has or the Danes hasn't helped us out, or NATO hasn't or wouldn't have came to help us when, in fact, they did after 9/11, which I find that hilarious because anyone who served in the Marine Corps, especially during his time frame, would know that whether it be in Iraq or Afghanistan, we always had either NATO or countries that were also NATO allies in either country.
Yeah, I was on a base with the Danes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So it's to me, it's like it's almost mocking. It's mocking in the fact that they downplay they downplay countries' assistance to us when per capita they suffered more than the United States or Australia has, or even Australia has. Because we look at the Danish militaries, the casualty they suffered, it was kind of like, and if you calculate it out, it was larger than the United States,
Yes.
just because of the size of it and the amount of casualty they received. But no, I don't see the United States currently, moving away from its trajectory in terms of doing things that would isolate itself from its allies or from the Western world. In fact, you could just point to, the recent tweets, statements, talking points that came out from the United States in the last few days about Greenland.
Yeah.
Which again is funny because Greenland allows the Danish military, or the Danes allows the United States a large degree of leadway in operating on that island. And so for them to say this and to say some of the other stuff is kind of mocking, and for them to use China as a means to an end in that, it's disingenuous because of the fact that yes, China does some of the stuff that the president alludes to in other places, and for him to essentially say, yeah, there's a flotilla of Chinese ships all around Greenland, when we know that's not true, gives China the ability to say, well, see, the United States is just causing trouble, and feeds back into that influence game that we talked about. Because again, China loves to use words and also to point out what the United States does wrong and do the exact opposite of it.
It does seem, like you said earlier, that it does seem that China has figured out if we just sit back and do nothing and continue just doing our thing, that this is actually the best way to gain further dominance and regional hegemony and international influence also.
Yeah.
Joaquin, mate, thank you again for spending time with me. I know people greatly appreciate you coming on, allowing me to pick your brain, telling us about very complex and highly nuanced situations that are occurring. Mate, I look forward to speaking to you next time. Is there anything in this that you think is important or in Venezuela that we have forgotten?
Not really. I do think, I do think one thing we haven't really touched upon is what the future of Venezuelan and Chinese relations would be.
Yeah,
And which,
please, if you want to discuss on that, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think one thing that should be noted is that the loans are still there. The billions of dollars that China loaned to Venezuela since Hugo Chavez is still there. And despite Xi Jinping standing with Maduro and Maduro and saying that, he's an ally, we trust him, things like that. Venezuela is a all-weather ally, which is, per the course of Chinese relations. Talk is all that is just talk. When you really look at how China actually operated in Venezuela. And then not only that, but they potentially see the current president, Delcy Rodriguez. I think that's how she said that. I think that's how you pronounce her name. They probably see her as a breath of fresh air compared to Maduro, who, he was essentially a lackey of Chavez, which is why he was put in place in power. And so they're probably coming up with ways with how to deal with that regime to where they can either salvage their influence within the country or gain enough of a foothold to somehow reemerge later. But then also, more importantly, to be able to repay the loans in the long term. Because those loans, I don't think neither the Venezuelans or Chinese will want those loans to be defaulted on.
What if America is saying like they are, that we're just going to take control of Venezuela? What if? How would America respond if Rodriguez said that we're going to start paying back loans to China? What would America see of that? And if the loan does default, what would China's position be to do anything?
Well, if the loans do default, then China could simply take the oil rigs back. It's nothing too big for them to do that because they're floating. They could just, send the ship and, transport it back to China or to anywhere else where they want to conduct drilling operations. They could likely take them to court to see if they can actually get loans out, to get some type of judgment against them. Now, granted, will that work or be enforceable? Possibly not. It just depends upon which agency they would actually pursue that through. Now, whether or not the United States will allow that to happen would largely depend upon Trump. And this is where I kind of do see him giving the green light to it ostensibly, saying that, these loans needs to be repaid. Venezuela will honor its commitments, because realistically, once Trump said that we will be taking control of Venezuelan oil, or Venezuela, as he said in some statements, China can then say, well, United States, you're on tap for these loans because you said you are going to take control of Venezuela. You control Venezuela, so we would like to get repaid for these loans. So that aspect goes back to role play that China likes to do. Yeah, you and the listeners should see a common theme in this episode whenever regarding wordplay, and China love for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they understand that. They understand that words have the power of meaning, and they will manipulate them or use them to great effect.
Absolutely, mate. I think that is a good place to end it. I think we have covered the majority of what we needed to around Venezuela, and as things emerge, evolve, or deteriorate, it'd be fantastic to have you back on to discuss what we are seeing. But as I've said, we can't judge the success of this overall operation in the first week. You can judge the success of the Delta Force aerial campaign, highly successful, but we can't judge US intervention in Venezuela of how this has been successful or failure for likely many years to come.
Exactly.
and this will continue to evolve. It may deteriorate. It may go well. I hope that this is putting Venezuela on a trajectory for the betterment of the people there that have been living under brutal regimes and in brutal conditions for a number of decades. And I'm sure most people think the same, regardless of international influence upon the country. But mate, look, thank you so much for joining me again. If anyone would like to go and follow Joaquin Sino Talk, I will provide the links below. Mate, thank you very much.
You're welcome, man. It's great to be on to talk about this. I really do appreciate you having me on, and you're thinking so highly of me to invite me on for a second time.
Mate, anytime. Thank you very much.